Hi everyone, my name is Drake Pledger and this is Flintlock Operator. Today we're going to be looking at a little bit of a different topic than what we've been talking about recently. We've talked a lot about guns, we've done some shooting, and we talked a lot about gear. But one thing that we haven't talked about yet is food. And today I'd like to start delving into that subject. Now, food is obviously very important for civilization in general, but on the frontier where the settlements and the forts and the people were so isolated, it was so vitally important. And of course you had crops that you could grow, you had some food that you could import over the mountains or down the river system. But most of the at least the meat that they would have been eating would have been wild game, and the forts and the settlements actually employed brave men to go out and go hunt for food. And this was a very, very dangerous job. And once that hunter got back with their meat, if there was any left over, they needed a way to preserve the meat. And out on the frontier, salt wasn't always ready to be had at hand. You could import salt over the mountains, like we said. You could boil down salt from the salt springs. But what about the times where you were running low on salt and you couldn't send out a party to go boil salt at the salt springs? Well, there's a method to preserve meat that was employed by Indians, by the hunters, by the traders, by everybody who was out on the frontier at that time. We're going to be talking about a food preservation technique today that's written about by none other than Nicholas Cresswell. Now, of course, Nicholas Cresswell is the young Englishman who came over to America, and we actually talked about his book a little bit in one of our more recent videos. And he describes a technique that his companions learned from the Indians. And we're going to be talking about that, and we're going to actually be doing that and talking about it in a way that we can reproduce it, not just out here in the woods, but we can reproduce it in our own homes and backyards. Everyone, thank you so much for watching. We're going to have a delicious, eaty meaty festival today. You guys stay tuned. All right, the passage in Nicholas's journal is found on page 75 of my copy. We're going to back up a little bit because Nicholas tells a buffalo hunting story that's rather interesting. Wednesday, May 17th, 1775. Stopped at Bracken Creek and went a-hunting, as they call it here. Mr. Rice, Johnston, and I went together. In a short time, Mr. Rice fired at a buffalo. Johnston and I went to him and found him standing behind a tree loading his gun, and the beast laid down about 500 yards from him. As soon as he was ready, we fired at him again, upon which he got up and run about a quarter mile, where our dogs bayed him till we came up and shot him. It was a large bull, from his breast to the top of his shoulder measuring 3 feet, from his nose to his tail 9 feet 6 inches. That's a big buffalo. Black and short horns, all before his shoulders, long hair, from that to the tail as short as a mouse. I am certain he would have weighed 1,000. Camped a little below the creek. Now we get to the part on meat preservation. So they've killed this large buffalo, and they're on this trip, and they can't eat all that meat in one sitting, so they need a way to prepare and preserve the meat. So here we go. Thursday, May 18th, 1775. All hands employed in curing our buffalo meat, which is done in a peculiar manner. The meat is first cut from the bones in thin slices like beefsteaks. Then 4 forked sticks are stuck in the ground in a square form, and small sticks laid on these forks in the form of a gridiron about 3 feet from the ground. The meat is laid on this and a slow fire put under it and turned until it is done. This is called jerking the meat. I believe it is an Indian method of preserving meat. It answers very well where salt is not to be had, and will keep a long time if it be secured from the wet. The lean parts eat very dry. The buffalo flesh differs very little from beef, only ranker taste. Hot weather. So Nicholas paints a really good picture for us in this passage. We learn about how many times they had to shoot a buffalo to be able to actually kill it, and then of course how they preserved the meat. Now we're going to go to our backyard campsite so we can experiment on our own and find out find out our own way that we can reproduce what Nicholas is talking about in our own backyards. Let's go ahead and head over there. Well, here's my backyard campsite. How do you guys like it? It's not much, but it'll do for now. We've obviously got my oilcloth tarp set up in a point diamond fashion. Got my little bed set up underneath there. I've got my rucksack full of gear, or my knapsack, excuse me. But this is where we're gonna focus our attention today. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at this. Now, as you can see, this is a little bit different from what Nicholas describes in his journal. He talks about having 4 forked sticks stuck into the ground. Now, what I've done here is made, I guess you could call it a quad pod. So basically tripod setup, but with 4 legs. And obviously we've strung some little sticks across here, but we've laid the smaller sticks across the top in a gridiron fashion, just like Nicholas described in his journal. Now, obviously, the one thing you can see is that I don't have a fire underneath here, and I don't think that the fire department here would be very happy if I just had a smoldering, unattended fire for hours and hours and hours on end. But we have a solution for that. Right, as you can see, I have a very 18th century correct orange extension cord going to the most authentic electric hot plate that James Townsend's has to offer. And in that, we've got my 8-inch cast iron skillet filled with mesquite wood chips for smoking. So essentially what we're gonna do is improvise our own smoker. And we're going to utilize modern as well as 18th century techniques to smoke this meat, or jerk it, as Nicholas calls it. While the hot plate's heating up, let's go ahead and talk about the type of meat that we're going to need. We're going to need very lean, very thin red meat here. So this is just, I believe is Milanese steak that I bought from just the store. And you cut it up into, inch and a half wide strips. And we're gonna lay this on the grid. Now, remember, it's very important to use as lean of meat as possible, because the more fat that is present on the meat, the more likely and more quickly it is to go rancid. But if you use a very lean meat and you keep it dry, it's gonna keep for a very, very long time. Hopefully you can see it. She started smoking. Time to put the meat on. All right, we're all set up and we're ready to go. Let's go ahead and lay the meat out on the gridiron. We want to make sure and keep a little bit of space between the pieces to allow as much as the smoke, heat, and warm air and rising air as possible between these, so it'll dry these pieces of meat out faster. Well, there it is. It all fit. Thank goodness. There's one more thing that we're gonna do to modify this little setup here. That's gonna help the meat cure and jerk a lot faster than it would if it was just out here in the open air. But the last thing that we're gonna do before we let this just smolder and go is we're gonna actually wrap this whole quad pod in canvas. So that way, when we wrap it, it'll help keep the smoke in and the heat in, and will help to jerk the meat much, much faster. Now at this point in the process, we can essentially just let this thing go, except we're gonna need to come back and check on the fire periodically, maybe every 20 to 30 minutes. Because what's gonna happen is whenever we put those wood pellets in there, they're going to burn and they're going to form this layer of ash and char on the bottom. That's actually gonna insulate the top levels of unburned pellets from the heat underneath. So we're gonna have to come around every now and then, and we're gonna need to mix things up and move some of the pellets around, as well as periodically come back and replenish the supply of pellets in the pan. In addition, we're gonna need to make sure and we've got all the holes and all the gaps, as many as possible at least. We need to make sure and have those all filled up. So even along the bottom edge here, we're gonna need to get that as close to the ground as possible. So now all we gotta do is just wait. It's been about an hour and a half since we left these, so let's go ahead and check out and see how they're doing. Ooh, yeah. So they're starting to really get dried out good, but they're still real gummy and squishy. It might be about halfway done. Looks like we're still smoking good down there, but I'll get down there and stir up the coals and add a little bit more on there. Check back with you in a little bit. And now the day is over. Reckon meat's been on here for about 6 or 7 hours. Got a still good amount of smoke in there. I've obviously changed out the fuel a couple times, but looks like it's pretty good. Relatively dry. I think it worked. All right, we're all finished here. Let's go ahead and give it a taste. It's not too bad. It definitely tastes like dried meat. It's not nearly as flavorful as modern day beef jerkies, but you know what? This is not supposed to be a fine finger food. It's not a delicacy. This is a survival and a sustainment type of food. So one of the cool things about this food is that we can use it just all on its own. We can eat it like this, or we can add it to other dishes. We can turn it into stews. We can turn it into pemmican, or we could just eat it like this. So this really is a very shelf stable. As long as we keep it dry, it's going to keep for a long time on the trail. It's something that's very historically accurate, and as we've seen, it's not that difficult to make, and it's not that bad either. Now obviously this wasn't a completely historical method of preserving the food, since we used the modern hot plate and we used the modern wood pellets, but it's something that we can, with modification, reproduce very easily in the backcountry and in the woods. All we'd have to do is have a low, smoky fire and just keep that fire going, low and smoldering and very, very smoky, just like Nicholas Cresswell talks about in his book. Now, one of the last things I'd like to cover regarding this type of food is food safety. Now, obviously, back during the 18th century, they didn't have knowledge of germ theory or bacteria, but we do today, and what this essentially is just a dried raw meat. And eating raw meat can have some potential dangers to it. We might get food poisoning, or we could get very sick from it. So it's going to be up to your choice to whether you preserve meat and eat it just like this, or one thing that you could do is throw it in the dehydrator. It needs to be above 145 degrees for a little bit. So if you could get that dehydrator up to 145 degrees or a little bit over, and get it at that temperature for 15 or 20 minutes, that's going to be more than the recommended CDC recommendation for having safe red meat to eat. So if you can get the temperature in the dehydrator above 145 degrees for a little bit, then that's going to make these a lot safer to eat. Thank you guys so much for coming on this journey of discovery. I'm really happy to know that this is a way that we can all reproduce this type of food that would have been very common in the backwoods during the 18th century, just as our friend Nicholas Cresswell talked about. I hope you guys can reproduce this, or it inspires you to get into historical reenactment, get into historical trekking and living history, or muzzle loading. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your views. Like, comment, and subscribe. Check us out on Instagram. And we'll see you on down the trail in the next video. Thank you so much. If you guys like pain, try stepping on one of these in moccasins. Single layer, single sole moccasins. Does not feel good. 0 out of 10. Would not recommend.